Ladies and gentlemen, namaskar, and welcome to the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at the Darbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art, with Rebecca Wragg Sykes in conversation with Tom Holland. Rebecca Wragg Sykes' Kindred is the redefining guide to the Neanderthals. Full of pioneering Palaeolithic research, it defeats the stereotype of brutish hominins and presents an imaginative, intelligent, and adaptable ancient relatives who survived more than 300,000 years of climatic upheaval. At a time in which the fate of our species is uncertain, Wragg Sykes' nuanced study of the Neanderthals is restorative, instilling an understanding of human ability and perseverance. Wragg Sykes joins Tom Holland for a spectacular conversation about her seminal work. I'm delighted to introduce our first guest. Rebecca Wragg Sykes is a prehistorian, an honorary fellow at the University of Liverpool, and a writer. She is the author of one of the 2021 New York Times list of 100 notable books, Kindred Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art, and is the winner of the 2021 PEN Hessell Tiltman Prize. Joining her is Tom Holland, an award-winning historian, translator, and broadcaster, who is the co-presenter of Europe's most downloaded history podcast, The Rest is History, and has written and presented several TV documentaries on subjects ranging from ISIS to dinosaurs. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And this is an enormous thrill for me because Kindred, Becky's book, absolutely one of the books of the century so far for me. It's absolutely cutting-edge work of archaeology and science, but also just wonderfully, wonderfully written. So, so excited to have the chance to talk to you about the book. But before we come on to Neanderthals specifically, could we set this story in the broadest possible sense? So we are Homo sapiens, all of us in the world. But we are not the only hominins that have existed, are we? And when we started coming out of Africa, going into Europe, into Asia, Australasia, America, over the course of that trip that brought Homo sapiens to every corner of the globe, we did meet other species of human, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know, this is probably the talk with the oldest chronological content at the festival here, although there was a stone tool in one of the other presentations, I think. But it is useful to give a bit of context for who are we talking about with Neanderthals and what is this strange vanished world that they were part of. And as Tom says, the period over which Neanderthals existed, so they are, in an evolutionary sense, they are our closest known relations, our closest fossil relations, another kind of human. And their existence spans an awful long time, about the same amount of time as our own species has had evolving. So roughly from about 350,000 years ago, and then they vanish about 40,000 years ago. But if you pick a point during that sort of enormous range of millennia, say 100,000 years ago, they're part of a world which is really teeming with many other kinds of ancient humans as well. So Neanderthals are there in Europe, but they're not just a European species, they are a Western Eurasian species. They have close cousins called the Denisovans, and we know that they lived from Siberia through to Tibet, perhaps even further east. In Southeast Asia, we've got...
The hobbits?
We have the little hobbit species, which are known as Homo floresiensis, from one of the islands there. Another tiny one as well. And then we've also got very late surviving Homo erectus, which is a much more ancient population, which we believe left Africa well before the Neanderthals evolved.
So Becky, an obvious question. We are in India,
Yes.
And obviously Homo sapiens came to India, else we wouldn't all be here. But were there hominins in India before Homo sapiens arrived here? Were there Neanderthals here?
Well, there's two questions. there absolutely were hominins in India. India has a very, very deep, ancient prehistory. We have stone tools from India going back nearly 2 million years. So somewhere between 1 to 1.7 million years ago, we have these objects called bifaces. So they are stone tools worked on two sides. Sometimes they're also called hand axes. And there's a famous site at Arampakan, which has produced this material, very, very old. And we have a stone tool record, so an archaeological record, that goes all the way through to more modern phases of prehistory. But what we don't have in India, sadly, is very many fossils.
So we don't know what species of hominins were making these tools?
There is one sort of key fossil, which is known as the Narmada skull. It's actually not a whole skull, it's the top part, so the cranium. But it's intriguing. I mean, the date is, we don't really know, because it comes from the river Narmada, but it comes from secondary deposits. So this is gravels that have been washed away. So we don't know the original geological context, which means we can't date it so well. So it could be anywhere from only 40,000 to nearly 250,000, which is not very helpful.
That's not very helpful at all.
No, but in anatomical terms, it's actually really intriguing, because aspects of the shape of the cranium, it has a very, very high measurement, sort of from here to the top, so it's very tall, which is kind of like us, but the shape of the back of the skull and quite a sloping forehead, that's much more reminiscent of more archaic forms.
So it's possible that this could be from an otherwise wholly unknown species that was specific to India, do you think? Or
potentially, or what it kind of looks like is where South Asia is in a geographic sense. It is a place of movement, of crossover, of merging, and the skull, the Narmada skull, actually seems to embody that in a sense. But I mean, you know, there's all sorts of very active, very exciting research projects going on in India at the moment, and it's you know, absolutely clear that there's going to be more and more information, and hopefully a richer fossil record will start to emerge as well.
So presumably the reason that we know about Neanderthals much more than we do about other species that precede Homo sapiens is that partly the geological record is better. The process of fossilization has been good. But also, I guess, simply because Europeans have been looking for fossils, perhaps in Europe, for obvious reasons, longer than anywhere else.
Well, it's kind of a mix of things, I think. I mean, you know, you need to have good places where sediment can accumulate. Sometimes that's caves. Sometimes the geology here doesn't have the same sorts of caves. There's different erosional processes. But, I mean, interestingly, there is quite an old research history within India as well. People have been, you know, studying this for a long time. And the first discovery of the Atarampakan site was actually, I think, in 1863.
Wow.
And it was Robert Bruce Foote found that site. And there is a strange connection there, because he was working with the Geological Survey in Madras, and one of his colleagues was called William King, who was actually the son of William King Sr., who is a professor working in Ireland, who named the Neanderthals. He gave them their species name.
Well, that's brilliantly. So Neanderthal is the Neander Valley, and it came from a valley in Germany, and it was found, he says, checking his notes, in 1856. Yes. So could you just tell us a story about how Neanderthals came to be found and named, and what people thought they originally were?
Yes, I mean, it's part of this context in the 19th century, where in the early 19th century and late 18th century, there's already a very extensive interest in geology and paleontology more widely. But in a sense, although people had sort of envisaged vanished forms of humanity, they were still surprised when they actually found some evidence for it. And the Neander Valley find itself is from 1856, but there had been two earlier known discoveries of fossils as well. One was from what's now Belgium, and the other was from Gibraltar, which was owned or operated
and which
by
actually
the
were the
British.
oldest, weren't they? Because they were only
They're
identified
older.
as Neanderthal later on.
Yes, exactly. So they went unrecognised. And it's kind of an interesting sort of thing to think about, you know, at what point do we become primed to recognise things as unusual? Whereas the German find was uncovered in the context of very large-scale infrastructure and quarrying.
And so what is it about these fossils that makes it evident that they are not Homo sapiens?
Just anatomically, it was quite clear by the 1850s that when this find was uncovered in Germany, it was actually a quarry manager who realised it wasn't an animal, and then he gave it to a local teacher who was involved with a natural history society, and he recognised again that it was probably very old, and then it was given to an anatomy professor. So that expertise was there to see that this was a human, but it was strange, it was very robust, and also the condition of the bone just made it look very, very old. And
so it gets given the name, Neanderthal is coined in 1859, which is also the year that Darwin releases The Origin of Species.
Yes.
And it sets up this idea, whether Darwin argues this, I mean, he doesn't so unsubtly, but it sets up this idea in the minds of scholars, in the minds of the general public, that animals have evolved from primitive conditions to kind of more refined conditions. And so is there a sense that Neanderthals serve to illustrate this idea that modern humans are the kind of the embodiment of sophistication and perfection, and that Neanderthals, therefore, almost by definition, are more primitive, more brutish, closer to animals?
Yes, I mean, from the beginning, there's an interesting tension, I think, with the way that Neanderthals are perceived. People, you know, who are very well versed in anatomy, and they understand sort of different animal histories, and they know chimp anatomy and things like this. They can see that the Neanderthal skull, and especially once the Gibraltar find was recognised as well, which happened in 1863, and then the fossil was named in 1864. At that point, they have a whole skull with a face, and they're able to see that it clearly is a kind of human, but it has other features which are more similar in some ways to what they were seeing with apes. And some people were sort of perceiving it as a real missing link, you know, like a halfway house. But others, like Thomas Huxley, were quite clear in thinking, no, it's far closer to humans than to gorillas.
It's what sets up the kind of the stereotype of the caveman as being brutish, big brow, kind of carrying a club, that kind of thing. I mean, that is basic. When people think of, you know, the caveman of the kind that you get in cartoons, they're thinking of Neanderthals.
Yes, I think, unfortunately, that's been really persistent as a cliche about Neanderthals, but it's kind of intriguing because even very early in the late 19th century, some of the reconstruction drawings that people were doing, imagining what Neanderthals really looked like, they show them with furs, even with, you know, tools with a handle that's quite sophisticated technology. So there are these sort of different ideas accumulating in the notion of Neanderthals as the other sort of human, and not everybody agrees with everybody as to you know, where they should fit.
But there's been a kind of evolution, hasn't there, in the understanding of them, and these have been expressed both in popular culture. So William Golding's famous novel *The Inheritors* portrays them as the victims of a genocide of a kind rather similar to what Europe had recently witnessed in the Second World War.
Yeah.
And that, I guess, is that reflecting currents in science as well as kind of broader society? Are people starting to think that Neanderthals might have been the victims of genocide on the part of Homo sapiens?
I mean, Golding's sort of framing of Neanderthals is very sort of fascinating because, you know, he was writing, that's 1955, that book. So it is basically a century after Neanderthal had been found, and there had been all sorts of discoveries. And from the early 20th century onwards, there was less focus for a few decades on the bodies of Neanderthals, and it became much more about their culture. So trying to sort of classify all the different stone tools, work out how old everything actually was, because this is before radiocarbon. So everything has to be relatively dated, like how deep is it in one site versus how deep in another site, what animals are there. So they're really trying to, you know, classify and create a framework to understand the archaeology. And there are also really important finds. For example, La Chapelle-aux-Cents is a French site where a Neanderthal was excavated in 1908, so very early, and it's nearly a complete skeleton, but it was sort of interpreted from the initial uncovering as a burial. And so there is a tension there as well, that people have expectations that maybe Neanderthals were burying each other, and they have stone tools, but there's also always the fact that, you know, there are what appear to be much more sophisticated cultures later made by Homo sapiens, against which they're always judged, somewhat unfairly, I think.
But I just want to read a passage from Kindred, which of course is subtitled Neanderthal Life, Love, Death and Art. So this is very much about, to the degree that one can talk about it, Neanderthal society, how Neanderthals saw the world. And you write about the world that the Neanderthals inhabit, that places and people were connected by presences of many kinds. Places and people were connected by flows of stone, meat, and other materials, but were also physically linked by tracks on trails. One might even claim that the first revolution imbuing land with social meaning belonged to Neanderthals, not Homo sapiens. Neanderthals first kindled history. So this idea that actually Neanderthals had a relationship to the land that they're inhabiting, that Homo sapiens will inherit.
Yes. And I mean, and you know, I have to say that it's only possible to write a whole book about Neanderthals like this because they have an extraordinary record. You know, I've mentioned many other hominin species, but we have huge amounts of information about Neanderthals. We have literally thousands of pieces of bone and teeth representing a couple of hundred individuals. We have hundreds and hundreds of archaeological sites with millions of the objects they made. So we can actually say a lot. And one of the really sort of important things that's emerged over the past few decades is the sort of interdisciplinary approach to their behavior. And so that includes things like, can we understand how they move around the landscape and occupy it in a seasonal way? Can we perhaps get an impression of Neanderthals knowing particular places, revisiting them over decades, and in some sites...
or centuries and perhaps millennia.
Yeah, absolutely. And in places where we have very good preservation and really nice detailed, you know, archives of, in stone tool form, but archives of presence over decades and centuries. You know, I was sort of wanting to explore the idea that those places are where notions of home begin to form, where memory really is becoming quite congealed around particular places in the landscape, whether that's a cave or a rock shelter. And of course, we know they moved between places as well, and it's very likely that other features in the landscape actually had a meaning and played a role within their own conception of time as well, I think.
If we can look at your subtitle, so Life, Love, Death and Art, look at life first.
Yeah.
So you've described, you know, these patterns of movement, but also of presumably there were times where they were stationary. And is there kind of any distinctive feature of their lifestyle that you can read in the record that to you seems to sum up what made their lifestyle distinctive?
I think one of the, I mean, there's so many different aspects of their behaviour that when we have really good evidence, we can really draw detail from, and some sites are almost, ethnographic in the spatial detail that's still preserved. But one of the things that I find very powerful when thinking about Neanderthals and writing about them is to consider the centrality of fire and hearths.
So they could control fire?
Oh, yes, they could, absolutely. And, the hearth as the center point of human attention and activity, that's common to us today. We still build our houses to some extent around hearths. That's extremely ancient, and that would have been part of Neanderthal social life, just as much as it was a center point for processing materials or, cooking food. And in some places we can do astonishing things with the preservation or sediments around hearths, for example. You can see, you can sort of take samples through the soil around a hearth, the ashes, and you can see where fat has dripped down into the sediments in a site from Spain called Abec Romani, which I write about a lot.
That's tens of thousands of years old.
Oh yeah, that's like 50,000 years old.
As though it happened.
Yeah, and sometimes the preservation is incredible enough that the hearth is there, the ashes, the charcoal, and there's like half of a burned branch still sticking out.
And how do you feel when you see that?
Well, it's always moving to think about the time depth that we deal with Neanderthals, and it's a challenge to bridge that gap. But hearths are magical because, and I say this in the book, they're like wormholes in time, because that is the point at which Neanderthals literally sat around that hearth. As archaeologists, we encircle that same space, we're excavating, we're in the exact points.
And you deal with, these are dead people. You're dealing with bones and scattered bones. But to see something like that, am I being over-romantic in saying that it kind of gives them a momentary touch of life for you?
No, of course. Archaeologists, archaeology as a discipline is pulled in two directions. It's historical, it's humanities, but it's also scientific, and we're very careful to be objective and use the scientific methods and approaches that we have. But I don't think most people who work in this discipline are unable to feel that emotional pull and just the privilege, actually, that it is to work on materials this old and to be able to touch it. And that's why I love archaeology. History is fascinating, but it's the materiality of archaeology that I love, and that I wanted to use the astonishing record we have and help people discover that, because it's not always accessible to people.
Well, because one of the wonderful things about your book is the way that you do, again and again, you get these moments where you feel, yes, these are people who are not unfathomably removed from us. But then equally, there are moments where you kind of make comments on them and you realize actually they're very different. So one of the comments about that I found fascinating was you say that in terms of lifestyle, in terms of sourcing food, actually, in some ways, they're closer to wolves than they are to how we live today.
Yeah, when we think about how Neanderthal sort of lives and societies are structured, if you're thinking about hunting, for example, and who is doing the hunting and how that work is divided, we can look to the ethnographic record, of course, and there's very rich evidence from recent and historic hunting and gathering populations around the world, and in many of those, women actually do hunt to some degree. But you can also look at other predators, the kind of predators that Neanderthals shared their world with as well, so lions, but also wolves. And, with lions, we assume that it's actually females doing all of the hunting and the males just lie around. So I don't think we're assuming that for Neanderthals, whereas with wolves, it's more of a shared group endeavour, and I find that as a more convincing structure, because everything else we see Neanderthals do points to them being really highly attuned to the qualities of materials and resources, but then they bring it back and they share it.
And you have the amazing detail, which really struck home to me, having been at Jaipur for the past 5 days and just eaten so much that that the Neanderthals had to eat twice our calorie load. And I slightly feel that's what I've been doing while I've been in Jaipur.
we did Neanderthal style, yeah.
So they eat a lot.
We think they did. I mean, obviously this is estimates, but it's based on the fact that their bodies, although they are slightly shorter on average, they have more massive bodies, very sort of thick bones, probably more massive muscle mass as well, and you need to fuel all of that. And they're living very intensive lifestyles. So in order to be able to survive, you have to be able to keep feeding yourself. And some of the, you know, the anatomical particularities of Neanderthals, rather than only being related to cold adaptation, which is what it used to be thought.
Because they lived for hundreds of thousands of years.
They did. They lived during true glacial periods, very, very cold, but also periods as warm or even slightly warmer than today. And so some of these particular features, for example, their large noses, huge chests, we think that maybe that's also an adaptation to just getting a lot of oxygen in so that their bodies can metabolize all this food that they are eating.
Mm. Okay, so that's life. We've done life. Let's move on to love. Love. So, Becky, the question we've all been waiting for. Neanderthals and love.
Liaisons on the step.
What do we know about Neanderthal sex life? I'm going to be upfront.
Well, I think what we have to do is make some informed inferences.
Very diplomatic.
Yes. I mean, one thing I think I'll say is that traditionally, and this is not just to do with sexual relations, but many aspects of Neanderthal life, there's been a tendency to draw not only on ethnography, but also primatology, and to look at our closest living relations, which are chimpanzees and bonobos, another kind of chimpanzee. Chimpanzees have been better studied for a long time. They have a very violent, very male-dominated society, and that kind of tended to be the default assumption that maybe Neanderthals were like that. Whereas, in fact, bonobos are not really like that. They are much more open to resolving their disputes. It's more female-dominated. And for me, I think there's no reason that we can't actually think maybe Neanderthals, some of them, were more like that. And so, yeah.
And what about a question that became very kind of very current during the COVID pandemic? There was the theory that people who contained Neanderthal, what a particular strand of Neanderthal DNA might be more vulnerable to COVID, I think. So presumably there is, we genetically we can trace the interbreeding of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals.
Yes, absolutely. And this has been one of the most exciting dynamic areas in this field, not just for Neanderthals, but human evolution more broadly. And it is only a decade ago, or 12 years ago rather, that we had the first draft genome for Neanderthals, and that allowed us to answer a question that had been there for a very long time, which was, did we actually meet them? And the evidence for that
were the children able to interbreed?
Exactly. So we know that there was interbreeding now, and everybody alive does actually have some Neanderthal DNA, although to varying amounts. So if you're from a sub-Saharan African background, you have probably less than 1%, and that is later inherited. So those populations didn't meet Neanderthals.
And I mean, this is probably an impossible question, but do we know whether this interbreeding is expressive of good interpersonal relations, i.e. different communities meeting and setting up together, or is it rape, or what is it possible to have any idea of how these interbreedings happened?
Well, the short answer is we don't know. The long answer is I think we should expect all sorts of things, to be honest, because not only did Neanderthals live across a very deep range of time, but they are existing, from where I live in Wales in the UK, we have Neanderthals, all the way through Europe in the Mediterranean, down into the Levant, Central Asia, and Siberia. And so, the meetings and the social context for that are going to be different, because Neanderthals were not clones of each other. They had differences in how they lived through time and across space. And in fact, we also know now that interbreeding was happening over a really long time span. So Neanderthals disappear about 40,000 years ago, and we used to believe that that was around the same time that Homo sapiens disperse out of Africa. But we know now that Homo sapiens are leaving way earlier, 180,000 years ago. They're already beginning to move into Eurasia. And the genetics supports the fact that there were meetings that early. We can see evidence that there is interbreeding going on probably before 200,000, and at various points through time, and even really, really late, sort of, just before 40,000, we have found fossil Homo sapiens in individual, for example, from Romania, who had a Neanderthal ancestor somewhere between 4 to 6 generations before they lived, which is incredibly recent.
Yeah.
And did they know that? I find that always a really intriguing question. Were they aware that their great-great-great, was a Neanderthal?
I mean, even the possibility of asking, was there perhaps love or something like that, is reflective of a really profound difference that happened, I guess, around the 60s. The idea, which was focused on, we're coming on to death now, focused on a cave system in Iraq, where it seemed that a disabled Neanderthal child had been buried, and that people had been buried with flowers. And this was very kind of in tune with the spirit of the time, flower power in the 60s and things. Now, I was very disappointed to learn from your book that inevitably scientists have
ruined it.
have ruined this. But what do we know about how Neanderthals saw death? Perhaps what understanding they had of the supernatural, of the divine? Did they have that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads and loads of really interesting angles to this. And the site you're talking about is Shanidar from Iraqi Kurdistan, which was first dug in the 60s, and there were remains, very huge cave, very impressive. And there were remains of about 9 different Neanderthals through the layers, so not all together. But some of them were in a cluster, and one of them was this famous flower burial, which so called because in the sediments around it, some pollen was identified, which was from flowering species local to the area. However, there is a however. On sort of reanalysis, and it was noted that in fact there are little rodent burrows that go through the layers, and they drag plants down into their burrows. So maybe not so sure about that, but excuse me, in terms of modern reanalysis, there's like a third part to that story, which is that a team from Cambridge have now gone back to this site again, and they found another Neanderthal right underneath these other ones, and they're able now to apply all of the 21st century methods of excavation and analysis to this particular individual who seems to be kind of lying on their side like this. And although it's not fully finished, the research, they have found, again, little bits of plant material in the sediments, and they think, at the least, that this might have been a natural sort of eroded channel which had been deepened, and then a body put in there. So
conscious, a kind of burial.
Yeah, so, that is going to definitely be a site to watch, I think, for future, proving or not about the issue of burial.
And one other site, if we come on to art, the last of, is a site called Bruniquel, have I pronounced that right?
Yes.
Which I read, again, gather from your book, is the only monumental construction known to have been made by Neanderthals. So can you tell us about the only monumental structure known to be made by Neanderthals? It sounds amazing.
Yes, this site is in southeast France. It's called Bruniquel. It's a cave that was only found relatively recently. And what makes it quite extraordinary is that it's very deep inside a hill. It's about 300 meters into this cave system. So it's totally in the dark. And there is a large chamber with 2 very big rings of snapped, broken off stalagmites, so, you know, the natural formations in the cave. It's about 2 tons worth, actually, 400 odd pieces that have been not only snapped and arranged, but they're actually selected by size, apparently. There's burning on these rings, and when they were dated, by dating the later concretions that grew over them, it came out at 174,000 years ago.
Wow.
And as far as we know, it is only Neanderthals in
So
France.
is this the oldest known example of monumental architecture anywhere in Eurasia, or indeed the world?
Well, I think you could probably argue that, and it's not just that they're sort of broken bits off and shoved them into rings, because when you look at the internal structure, they are actually constructed, they're built.
The French must be so proud of that.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, it's extremely difficult to get into that cave. There's all sorts of horrible crawling bits, so it's never going to be visitable, unfortunately. Okay. But yeah.
So I've got one last question before I open it to the floor, and that is, of course, the obvious question, which has been hanging over everything that we've been talking about, which I'm sure you've been dreading because you knew it was going to come, which is what happened to them?
Well,
why did they go extinct?
Technically, you can argue that they're not entirely extinct because
we have them.
Somewhere between 20 to perhaps up to 50% of their genome is still around in living people, although different parts of it are present in different populations around the world. So they're not totally gone, but they're obviously not walking around in their original form either. So I think what I can say and what reflects quite fairly thinking, current thinking, is that it's not just one thing that explains this. For example, people used to maybe wonder, was it climate? Did it just get really, really cold around 40,000 years ago? And yes, it was cold, it was getting colder, but they had survived cold things like that before.
But presumably, as it gets colder, perhaps opportunities for this vast calorific intake that they need to diminish, and particularly if there are other people, Homo sapiens are turning up and nicking all the mammoths.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we know that they had shared, to some extent, their landscapes with other hominins, denisovans, and Homo sapiens for a very long time. And they had survived cold things before. So it can't just be those two things. There has to be another element at play. And it's identifying that, I think, that's the real key.
But I mean, it's for us, it's a kind of, there's a disturbing metaphysical quality to the question, isn't there? Because if we are responsible for the destruction of another human species, I mean, it shadows us, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's no direct evidence at all for conflict, for any, certainly there was no, big Neander war. But what may have happened is that a different population, a later population of Homo sapiens, we know begin dispersing from Africa about 60,000 years ago, and they may have been bringing different kinds of technology, projectile weaponry, in fact. So perhaps some of that was used in anger, but they may also have just very incrementally outcompeted Neanderthals without actually fighting.
Am I right that the last known specimens are from Gibraltar, which
not necessarily. No, the dates from Gibraltar are on Charcon. They were done a little while ago, so I don't think Gibraltar necessarily has a claim to be.
So where are the latest known specimens?
Well, there's sort of all over the place, really, and that's also interesting.
So the idea that I always had that they were being forced kind of down towards south of Spain.
Looking at the peninsulas of Europe is easy and it makes sense because they are physical endpoints. But this 40,000-ish date does seem to be the case in many places.
Right.
But what we don't know...
So it could be disease, perhaps. Or,
could be disease, it could be... I think it's going to be many different things. Yeah. There's many endings in many places, and we don't know how far east Neanderthals got. They may have been in India.
And Becky, just to emphasise that there is so much information here. It is so amazing to read about these people who lived so long ago, and you give us all this information, but you do also throughout, you're absolutely upfront about what we don't know. And there is obviously so much we don't know.
Yeah. that's the challenge. That's why I love writing and thinking about them, because there is so much information, but there's always that challenge of sort of the time depth and not trying to make assumptions about them.
Yeah.
Well.
Okay. So I think that I have monopolised you quite long enough. So if people have questions, gentlemen in the front. I can't see who else there is. Gentleman there. Gentleman there.
Okay, so I was reading a while ago, there was some cave art found by the Neanderthals, if I'm not, it was near Spain. And you have also elaborated how Neanderthals continuously interacted with Homo sapiens a while ago. So, like, did they have any, did that impact the Homo sapiens in some way, culturally?
In terms of, were there cultural impacts when they met? That's one of the hardest things for us to answer. So the DNA is absolutely saying they definitely met, and in some cases, both populations were able to raise hybrid children, and those children survived. So, you know, you can read something into that, but what we don't know is whether the groups actually merged. Did they live together, or were these one-off encounters that were very brief, and there was no real cultural sharing? And this is where it's controversial, because for some scholars, they think that they can identify particular layers where the archaeology seems to have a hybrid character as well in the stone tools. Other archaeologists will point out there's very few cases where those layers are actually intact, and maybe it's literally the sediment has mixed and the layers have actually mixed, and it's not a real hybrid. So I think personally I would tend to be more cautious about it, because there's only 2 places where we have this apparent culture mix with Neanderthal remains, and in both those instances more recent analysis does suggest it's perhaps not reliable. For me, I think at the moment we don't have any clear evidence of what cultural mixing really looked like, but I would, you know, absolutely say that Neanderthals would have had something to teach Homo sapiens about the land they lived in, because they knew it. You know, they had a very clear, deep ecological knowledge. Neanderthals made the first synthetic material, a glue made from birch bark, kind of tree. They invented that. And it's that level of, you know, indigenous ecological knowledge that they had that they may have been able to transmit to Homo sapiens, because we know some of the DNA we received from them was also useful, and we kept, you know, genes related to immunity, for example. So maybe some of the cultural information, if it was shared, then that also may have helped us.
Neanderthals invented glue is an absolutely top fact. So someone from the back, yes, lady right at the back. There, in the green, I think. Yes.
Thank you for such a fascinating discussion. My question is not directly about Neanderthals, but about Homo sapiens. Mm-hmm. Could you comment or shed some more light on this notion of a mitochondrial mother or mitochondrial Eve, that there was an evolutionary bottleneck and perhaps potentially all humans are descended from a small group of Homo sapiens? Thank you.
Thank you. I will preface.
Touch on a book you might be writing.
No, yes, my next book is going to be about all of prehistory, all 5 million years of it, but focusing about women, in fact, all the different experiences of women. But to answer your question, I will have to say I'm not a geneticist, I am an archaeologist. Yeah, in theory, there is a single ancestor from which the female lineages, which is, you know, the mitochondrial DNA is sort of the energy part of a cell, and that is only descending through the female line. But as I understand it, there wasn't necessarily literally a single woman. But yes, there does seem to have been a bottleneck. And this is also something really interesting, actually, in terms of the very recent changes in our understanding of the whole history of Homo sapiens going through Eurasia, which is that the very early movements of people, a lot of those populations, those pioneer populations much earlier than 40,000 years ago, they actually vanish. They do not have genetic descendants in living people. So in some ways, it's not just Neanderthals who went extinct. Many of those early waves of Homo sapiens, they're also extinct in a way. So I quite like the fact that some of the narratives are being flipped, that we did not just arrive 40,000 years ago and sweep all of the other residents of Eurasia aside, and then we're just there and we have suddenly successfully colonized it. It's far more complicated than that.
That's always very much the theme of your book. Things are always more complicated than you think, and more interesting. And more interesting. Yes, the gentleman there who was...
Hi, thanks. I thought it was a really interesting talk. On the topic of burial, I remember reading in a book about Central Asia a while ago about I think it was a Neanderthal child who was found with skulls, sort of animal skulls, arranged very kind of particularly around the burial itself. So I've always had this picture of there being this sort of ritual element, or at least sort of real kind of burials that the Neanderthals had made. Have I got that completely wrong, or are there sort of any other signs of sort of ritual elements?
The site you're talking about is called Tashiktash from Uzbekistan, and it is a young child, I think about sort of 9 or 11 years old. I think the interpretation of that particular site, where I think it was wild sheep skulls, just a few of them, or goat, I'm not entirely sure about that, because again, it's one of these ones that was excavated a little while ago, and our standards today are a lot higher when you claim particular things are associated with a burial. You know, you need to have a lot of very clear sediment context and linking. So I'm not so sure about that one. I think in the book I say I don't know about that one. But there are other contexts where there might be a little bit of evidence for grave goods, although it seems extremely rare for Neanderthals. We have quite a number of reasonable arguments to make for the deposition of bodies, but not with stuff. Now, the exceptions, there's a site called Amud from Israel today, and that's, again, it's a child actually, a bit younger, and they were buried sort of at the edge of a cave, and right on their hips is the jawbone of a deer, which doesn't sound very exciting, but in fact, in the rest of that site, all the rest of the animal bones are massively smashed up, very heavily processed, which is normal. They're going for the marrow. That one is pretty much complete, so it's anomalous. And it was definitely on the body, because there is no sediment between that animal bone and the skeleton of the Neanderthal child, so it wasn't in a different layer. So that's one. And then also at Shanidar, which we talked about earlier, this new skeleton called Shanidar Z, that individual is, as I said, they're kind of like lying on their side like this, and quite close to where their fingers are is a stone flake. And again, it's not like a very special flake, it's just a flake of stone, but it's bigger than most of the other material in that layer. So there's always these sort of, we have to hedge and make all these caveats, but those are basically the best, richest examples we have for Neanderthal grave goods, which is not huge. But I will say that, you know, the attention on Homo sapiens and their burial record is always focused on the European Paleolithic, you know, the Ice Age burials, which are rich. If you look at early Homo sapiens in Africa, there's virtually no sort of evidence for skeletal deposition. And Neanderthals, they have a much richer burial record than that.
So they got there first.
In some ways.
Okay, we have time for one last question. This gentleman here has been very patient. But if it could be quick, sure. And Becky, also if you're...
Sure. Yes.
I'd like to come back to what Mr. Holland started with, about the Indian situation. Now, according to Harari and an Indian writer...
so I have to ask you to be quick. I'm so sorry.
The question is that according to this narrative, when the Homo sapiens arrived in India, they found what has been described as a strong population, and they had to divert and go around that population and go on to their further journey. And they came. The next mention of Homo sapiens is only 25,000 years later. And I would like to connect it with Denisovians. Is there any possibility that Denisovians may have been there?
Well, okay, Denisovans, maybe. We don't know. As I said, there's just one fossil skull, really, from India. But in terms of Homo sapiens, I don't have time to give the detail. There's definitely archaeological evidence. Oh my God! What I'll say is, please look at, go online, look at the Sharma Heritage Centre. Professor Shanti Papu is a leading expert on this, and there's loads of information about Indian, the Paleolithic and human origins. So go and find that website, and there's fantastic resources there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Becky. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
And with that, we would like to thank Rebecca, Wragg Sykes, and Tom Holland for this riveting session. Authors will be signing their books at the book signing desk located just outside the hall. We'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsor.